Damos inicio a continuación a nuestro seminario presentando la conferencia del señor David Atkinson, quien es académico de Geografía Cultural e Histórica del Departamento de Geografía, Medio Ambiente y Ciencias de la Tierra de la Universidad de Hull del Reino Unido.
It's an enormous pleasure to be here in Chile, in Santiago, in this great city. And my hosts have made me feel very welcome. I'd like to thank them for the invitation and thank them for the kindness they have shown since I've been here. It's also nice because although it's the middle of winter here in Chile, it's still nicer weather than we had in England in the summer back in Europe. I'm going to talk to you today about some of my research over the last 15 years. I'm a human geographer, and I've been using geographical approaches to explore ideas of patrimonio, or as we say in English-speaking debates, heritage or memory. And as a geographer, I always like to discuss ideas of patrimonio in relation to geographical concepts like territorial and space and place. And I do this because, in my opinion, a sophisticated, advanced understanding of patrimonio cannot be separated from the connected issues of territorial and space and place. And this is because the natural patrimonio of a natural landscape and their adaptation and their change by human society, these sites are always geographical. You cannot think about them without thinking about the geography. But also cultural heritage of human behavior and human activities is equally about territorial and space and place as well, because all history, of course, takes place in space. It's embedded in distinctive places. It's impossible to think about past society, historic society, and its trade and its business and its faith and its politics without thinking about the spaces and the territories which frames these events and which help to produce and to create and to constitute these particular spaces. But more particularly for heritage professionals charged with looking after heritage sites or places which tell us something about the past, then cultural heritage seems to celebrate or has to celebrate a particular site of somebody's life in that place, or a specific historic building or a town. And these are all geographical concepts. Or heritage that celebrates an industry, perhaps a past defunct industry. Nevertheless, is specific to a particular place or region, and you cannot understand it without thinking about that region and about the place and about the territorial as well. And finally, contemporary events, and we see many of these in Europe in particular. I think it's happening in Chile as well. The reenactments of the past and parades and festivals and celebrations of patrimonio. These events always are embedded in particular spaces. They, as we say in English, they take place, they happen, they occur in particular spaces. So therefore, like other human geographers in the English-speaking world, I think we must think about patrimonio in terms of how it connects to and is embedded within patrimonio. And this means we can't think of a heritage site, a place of heritage, a bounded space of heritage in isolation with its heritage manifest and demonstrated at one particular site, because like human behavior, it spreads out across regions and across the world, across different countries. So rather, we need to enmesh all heritage within its wider spatial territories and its wider spatial connections to different parts of the world. Because without this sense of a broader geography of the territorial of patrimonio, we'll have a weaker appreciation of what patrimonio actually is. So to spatialize, as we call it in English-speaking geography, to spatialize patrimonio is additionally important because patrimonio is a phenomenon which now touches so many different corners of the world. And to some commentators, and particularly to local and regional and national governments around the world, patrimonio is seen as a key driver for economic regeneration and development. It's also seen as being key, as being fundamental to maintaining and promoting national, regional, and local identities in a globalizing world. The distinctiveness of your place can be celebrated and enhanced by a sense of patrimonio. So increasingly, nations and cities and towns, and even small villages, celebrate their heritage in some way. And again here, Patrimonio y Territorio, they're enmeshed, they're entwined together. So today, I'm going to explore some of my work in the light of English-speaking debates about, as we call them, heritage sites and places of memory, and how they make these connections to territoria, how we cannot understand them without thinking about the territoria, thinking about the geographies of what is happening here as well. And I do this by looking at two particularly quite spectacular heritage sites in Italy, where I do a lot of my research, but also a few quick examples from northern England, where I live and work as well. So, first, some quick theoretical context for you. And I'll talk about how ideas of history and patrimonio and memory have become less elitist and less strictly defined and more widely used by people in all parts of the world, but particularly I'm talking about the English-speaking world at the moment in recent years. A generation ago in England, the production of memory, the policing of memory, was a serious, formal, scholarly business. History was an elite concern, debated by university academics and professors, and published in dry, scholarly, inaccessible books. And when heritage was communicated to the public, when it did go out to ordinary people, it was often through these rather top-down initiatives as well. The historic artifacts, for example, would be enshrined in glass cases in museums, and we were told to go and look at these things and to gaze upon our history and our identity and to learn from that, not to touch them, not to engage them or think about them, just look at them. Or important figures were remembered in public space through statues or through monuments or in the names of streets and public squares, such as Avenue Bernardo O'Higgins, which I came down the road in the taxi this morning. And this kind of what we might call official, state-sanctioned memory, which told the public what they were supposed to remember, what they were supposed to know, what they were supposed to celebrate, was decided by an elite group of professors and curators and museum experts who were, it was imagined, who were the ones who were qualified. They were the experts who could tell us how to interpret the past. And therefore, in virtually all of these cases, until 20, 30 years ago in the English-speaking world, history was written by those with political or social or intellectual authority in society. And ordinary people were supposed to consume this patrimonio, but not to produce it themselves, not to think about it themselves. The range of patrimonio was therefore limited, and elite perspectives meant that for the most part, elite issues and elite people were addressed. And the views and the histories of ordinary people received far less attention. Also, patrimonio was communicated via particular formal sites, bounded spaces, certain places where you would go and see patrimonio or engage with patrimonio, like museums or heritage sites or monuments, where memory was located but also is fixed there and enshrined in this one particular place. That is where memory is, nowhere else. And even with the arrival of specialist heritage organisations like UNESCO or Dibam, who are kindly hosting us here today, this problem persists because these heritage organisations have to select a particular heritage site. You can't talk about it everywhere. They have to draw a boundary around a particular site, which is emblematic of the heritage that they are trying to talk about. So sometimes, as with national parks, you can talk about a larger region, but often with human cultural heritage, this is not so straightforward. How can we trace and represent the flows of human experience, of movements, of trade, of ideas, of religious faith, of community? How can you represent these things in one particular site? This is a struggle. This is a problem which we have to deal with. This is very challenging, and you know this, as some of the people in the audience are trying to deal with these ideas. But what I'm going to do today is outline various examples from my research that demonstrate that patrimonio is rarely as bounded and neatly defined as heritage sites by their nature happen to suggest sometimes. I also argue that the process of cultural heritage, the processes of cultural heritage, have a wider reach than some of these places can represent, can encompass, can talk about. And secondly, I will also show how other voices always and perhaps inevitably, always and inevitably join in and confuse the elite top-down perspectives upon monuments and heritage sites and patrimonio. And this is something we have to deal with as well. So thinking about the territories of heritage sites. My first example is the Vittorio Emanuele II monument, the Altare della Patria in Rome, in Italy. It's a very beautiful city, and I've been lucky enough to live there for a couple of years. And this is a key, the Vittorio Emanuele monument, is a key national expression of Italian heritage and identity. And many national events regularly, as we say, take place, happen, are celebrated on its steps. But we cannot understand how this monument works, how it functions, and the meanings and identities which it produces, unless we also think about the geographies of the monument and the space it fills in the heart of Rome, in the heart of the Eternal City. The Vittorio Emanuele II monument was built between 1885 and 1911 to commemorate the first king of United Italy, Vittorio Emanuele II. But it was also designed explicitly as a statement about the new Italian nation, only in existence since 1861, and then only in possession of Rome from 1870 onwards. And 1885, they start to build this monument to embody, to articulate the sense of Italianità, of Italianness. It was designed, therefore, as this statement about the new Italian nation. It narrated the geographical unity of the newly reunified Italy, and it asserted the arrival of this new nation-state as a modern European nation-state, on a par with Germany or France or Britain. And finally, the monument also provided a symbolic heart for the reunified nation and a national icon in the centre of the capital, the new capital of Rome. And the monument articulated this new national identity and this new national patrimonio for Italians through design, through statues, and through iconography. But we can't understand all of this simply in terms of art history. We also have to think about how it was designed for a particular space and a particular place and a particular site as well. You see here in the foreground, here's the monument down here, and here's the Capitoline Hill behind it, which is the hill upon which Rome was founded originally. And then over here is a Roman Forum when the Roman Empire established. This became the key political and trading spaces of the Roman Empire. So this huge confection of white marble is right in the centre of the symbolic heart of Rome. The Roman Colosseum is up there at that end of this street, which was built by Benito Mussolini in 1932, but that's a story for another day. So it was built in this consciously symbolic place in the heart of ancient Rome, and it's a conscious attempt to connect the new reunified Italy to a shared history of the Roman Empire in times past, when Italy again was united and a powerful nation, the most powerful nation in the European world and European realm at that particular time. And also, the form of the monument explicitly draws upon these connections and echoes the form of the Capitoline Square, which is right behind the monument, as I showed you just around here. Explicitly apes that form, which is a great Renaissance square designed by Michelangelo Buonarroti in the mid-16th century. And it refers again, therefore, to a period of former Italian glory to suggest that Italian glory will develop once more. The form, therefore, of the Capitoline Square, as you see here, with the statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the equestrian statue, and we've seen these, I've seen past several of these in the taxi this morning coming down the road from my hotel. This equestrian statue, it's got its origins, all flow from this statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which was preserved in Rome, but also the City Hall of Rome and the Goddess of Rome, a small statue there, which is, you can see here, is a little bit larger scale. These two statues of the Goddess of Rome and Marcus Aurelius are echoed in the monument. And we have the Goddess of Rome here, next to the tomb of the unknown soldier in the front of the monument. I'll show you this again in a second. And also the statue of Vittorio Emanuele II, again on a equestrian horse, just like Marcus Aurelius. These same things, the Dea Roma and the equestrian statue, locked into the center of the monument. It's a deliberate evocation of the heritage of ancient Rome in this new national monument. But the monument also, and this is some work I did with Dennis Cosgrove, my old supervisor who sadly died a few years ago, but this monument was also designed, we discovered, as a narrative of Italian geographical unity. The fountains at the base, you can see here, over that side, and that side, represent the two seas to the either side of the peninsula, the Italian peninsula. The statues at the top of the monument, the 96 provinces of Italy, all have a statue all the way along the edifice along here, so representing all of Italy brought together in this one particular monument. And then there's 16 major Renaissance cities of Italy's period of great cultural fluorescence and learning in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, all around this plinth here, which holds up the statue of Vittorio Emanuele himself. And then the Dea Roma is here in the center, and then the statue of the unknown soldier, the tomb of the Italian unknown soldier is located underneath. So this is all a narrative about all of Italy being brought together and unified in this one monument, established here, right in the heart of ancient Rome, right in the heart of the ancient Roman Empire. So it's loaded and freighted with lots and lots of symbolism. But further, it was designed, this kind of style, you may recognize it from various places you've been to, it's designed in the contemporary, it was called the international modern style of classical, neoclassical Beaux-Arts styling, which is comparable to other European cities of the day. If you go to Vienna or Paris or London or Berlin, Washington, D.C., or indeed, I was in the Biblioteca Nazionale here in Chile yesterday, the same kind of Beaux-Arts international style. Every nation around the world, capital cities around the world, all trying to lay claim to an imperial heritage, to a sense that they were the heirs to the ancient Roman Empire, and to the learning, to the engineering, to the legislative might of this phenomenal entity on the face of the earth, which shaped Western ways of thinking and understanding ever since. The Italians, of course, say, well, Paris, Budapest, London, Santiago, if they're using this form, why shouldn't we use this form? We are the Romans. We are the people who were with the direct descendants of the Roman Empire. And so they use this style as well to emphasize again that Rome has been reborn in the new Italian state. But also the design and the vast scale, as we see, of the confection. Sorry, I forgot to show you this slide. Again, there's some of those statues and the equestrian statue there. The vast scale and decoration of the monument were also intended to challenge the papacy and to remake papal Rome, the Rome of the popes since the 4th and 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire, to remake Rome of the popes into the new Italian national capital. In 1870, the Italians reunified their nation by seizing the papal states, which was a territorial entity across the heart of Italy, splitting the country in two. You can see here. So the Pope was essentially king of that territory as well. It was seized by the Italians. The Pope retreated into the Vatican palaces, and there was a great deal of hostility. People who were elected to official roles in the new Italian state were excommunicated by the Catholic Church. There's very serious issues. More slowly. Sorry. And there was much hostility from the church towards Rome, towards the new secular Italian nation. And in turn, this grandiose, dazzling monument is intended to take on the papacy, to demonstrate the arrival of a new actor, a new power in the city of Rome. You see the Vatican behind it, and then up on the skyline, Vittorio Emanuele and his monuments, contesting the skyline with the dazzling marble brought down from Brescia in the north of Italy, especially to mark itself into the city, to mark the arrival of the new Italian state. So the structure, therefore, embodies a narrative of Italian unity, written in marble and stone and bronze statues. It also announced the triumph of the secular Italian state against the papacy, and undertook both these tasks, and here's my point, undertook both these tasks by invoking the heritage of ancient Rome to talk about a new revived Italian unity, but also by siting itself on the Capitoline Hill, in the centre of ancient Rome, and asserting its message to Rome and to the world beyond the city. So these points, I think, reinforce the fact that we cannot think about heritage sites, about patrimonio, without thinking about territorio, about their wider geographies and their wider territories. And the Vittorio Emanuele monument also reminds us that despite the fine intentions of the designers and the monument's architects, and the formal and very serious, sober meanings about national unity and identity and togetherness which it embodied, these messages can also be undermined by the reception by critics and by the public. And because this monument doesn't really fit into the heart of medieval Rome, and this is the design, it's designed to be different, to be huge, to be white, to be dazzling. It's designed to be different, but it also attracted criticism because of this. Italians, never been particularly convinced by calls to affiliate with the Italian nation state, today or indeed in the past, were largely indifferent to this new monument, calling it the wedding cake. Overseas commentators were particularly critical, accusing the structure of, in some words, of Augustus Hare, a British architectural commentator, of ruining the eternal city and being an unforgivable intrusion into the heart of medieval Rome. American troops liberating Rome in 1945 called it the typewriter or the false teeth. And even today's guidebooks complain about the sites. The Rough Guide, for example, calls it too big, too white, and altogether too boastful. And this casual disdain reminds us that consumers, those of us dealing with heritage issues, that consumers of heritage sites are not passive recipients of the meanings which we propose and the meanings we design into these sites, but they will often construct their own interpretations. And this is an example of what, in the English-speaking world, we call dissonance heritage, the dissonance, different voices and contesting senses of what these places are about, and how they clash and contest with each other at certain heritage sites. And we have to take these things on board and to deal with these different perspectives. My second example is this place, the Risiera di San Saba in Trieste in northeastern Italy. This is another Italian national monument, about 50 or 60 Italian national monuments. And this has got an even more serious and sober and upsetting, or a more serious, sober, and I think upsetting message as well, because this monument likewise is contested. It is also about its embeddedness in the city, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but it's very different to the extroverted narrative of the Vittorio Emanuele monument, spreading out a story of the arrival of a new Italian city, a new Italian nation state. The relative silence that surrounds the Risiera di San Saba is due to its notorious role as the only Nazi death camp to operate in Italy during World War II, in occupied Italy. And again, we cannot understand the history and the design and the use of the Risiera de San Saba now as a memorial site, as you see before you, without a sense of territorio and the geography of the site and the wider geographies of the city of Trieste and the surrounding region. Until 1919, Trieste was the major port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its third largest city behind Prague and Budapest. It was a thriving, successful, multicultural place. It was taken as being a model of how cities might be in the future. You can see it's just down here, and the port for the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. But after the First World War, as the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire was carved apart by the British and the French and the Italians, Trieste became Italian territory because it had an Italian ethnic majority in the city itself. And so the territory of Italy stretched around into the newly created state of Yugoslavia and enclosed Trieste in a little strip of land extending from the northeast parts of Italy. See here. You can see here in the foreground, this is Trieste today, and it's got a very beautiful setting, as you can see. Later, under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini from 1922 to 1943, because of his interest in national identity and Italianità, they caused ethnic tensions in this previously successful multicultural city by persecuting Slovene and Croat minorities and celebrating the Italian majority in the city. So there was a rising problem of ethnic tension in Trieste in that particular period. And this was made still worse when between 1943, October 1943 and April 1945, Trieste was occupied by German forces after the fall of the Italian fascist regime. And they established a concentration camp in a rice mill in the suburbs of Trieste for incarcerating, torturing, executing their enemies, often Italian partisans and Yugoslav resistance fighters, but also the Risiera was used for the transportation of the Jews of that region of northeastern Adriatic to the different larger death camp complexes of Central Europe under the Nazi regime. And the Risiera was not a death camp designed solely to murder people, as Auschwitz-Birkenau was, for example, but it was nevertheless a very deadly place. 20,000 people were held there at various times. 20,000 other people were deported from there to other camps in the Nazi network around Europe. And this extraordinary movement of people which the Nazis invested in at that particular time of the war effort. At the site itself, between 3,000 to 5,000 people, this is the camp just after the war, between 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed in the camp itself in just 18 months between late 1943 and April 1945, and a crematorio was installed to dispose of these bodies effectively. And the remains of the crematorio you can see in the top left, which is the bombed out damage the Germans bombed this to try and disguise the results of their actions. So this, therefore, is a very deeply disturbing and problematic history. But I argue that this memorial at this particular site, which you see here, this is some of the aspects of the memorial, doesn't really work as well as it might do, precisely because it seems to deny any connections with the wider world beyond the camp. It denies its wider geographies, the spatialities of the processes which I've just described. And also this terrible history. Despite this terrible history, this is another heritage site which is contested by dissonant voices, by different voices with sense of different meanings. And I'll talk about these a little bit later on. So how was this monument produced? When the Nazis retreated from Trieste in 1945, they blew up the crematorium to destroy evidence of what they had done. These are the archive photos in Trieste Archive about what the site looked like in 1945. And after 1945, the site housed displaced refugees from Yugoslavia until the 1950s, when it then fell into disuse. The plan to transform it into a heritage and memorial site was proposed by the City Council of Trieste in 1963. And an architectural competition was called, and a second edition was enacted. And it was eventually won by a local architect, a man called Romano Boico. And it is his design that's particularly interesting here. The camp and its rather dark heritage, or what we call in the English-speaking world is dark heritage of places like Auschwitz-Birkenau or the Risiero de San Saba, was a problem and an embarrassment for Trieste, in part due to questions of territory. The Risiero was located within the suburbs of Trieste, by the football stadium and overlooked by houses. And so the people of Trieste knew that what was happening there. It was a very violent episode in the city, the Nazis on the streets and lots of summary executions. So it's a very difficult period to be in Trieste. But nevertheless, this wasn't happening out in the woods or somewhere else. This was happening in the heart of the city. You can see this is the suburbs of Trieste, and it's just on the bottom of this road down here. And I'll show you the site today. This is the site of where the Risiero de San Saba is today. It used to stretch out down here. And as you can see, there's a hill with lots of houses on overlooking the site in the bottom of a valley. And then the city's football stadium was there, and there's a new stadium there for the World Cup in 1990. So this is in the city. This is part of the city, this death camp. Likewise, some of the local people, through coercion, but also perhaps through conviction, were involved in helping the Nazis to run the camp, in servicing the camp. They knew what was happening there. And the commandant of the camp, a very notorious Nazi, a man called Odilo Globocnik, who'd been involved in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, the murder of 400,000 people 18 months previously, was from Trieste. He was a local man, brought back to his home city to run the Nazi establishment in Trieste. So this is a dark and disturbing, problematic history for the city of Trieste. And so Boico's scheme to memorialize the camp seems to deliberately, in my interpretation, this is a paper that I'm writing at the moment, seems to deliberately separate it and this particular dark, horrible history from the rest of the city of Trieste. His rather abstract and modernist design, which as we see here, maintain the existing fabrics. You can see some of the old fabric of the mill there on the top two pictures, and inside them the holding cells on the left-hand side here, and some of the other structures inside the old fabric. And also the site of the crematoria where the bodies were disposed of is marked on the site by polished steel in the floor. See down here. And there's one piece of sculpture which is supposed to represent the smoke of the bodies ascending up into the air, which is this one here. You can see it there. But the rest of the courtyard, as you can see in the picture on the bottom left-hand side, is surrounded by these high concrete walls, 11 meters high, that seal off the camp from the rest of the city. You can't see in, you can't see out. This becomes a separate place. And the site is entered also down a long, often dark, quite oppressive corridor. You see it here with 3 meters wide and walls, which are again 11 meters high, and it's 45 meters long. And as you go down this, as you walk down this, you lose the sunlight, you lose the noise of the city, and you get this sense of actually going into somewhere different, somewhere separate, somewhere which is not of this city, not of this place, not of this world. Somewhere different and unique and somewhere else. Boico himself, the architect, wrote about the need, in his words, to seal off this site and what happened there. He talked about making the camp, again, his words, a sacred space and a separate space. And his memorial, it seems to me, does exactly that. It produced a detached site which is isolated from the rest of the city. And perhaps, you can see it here from the outside, on the street here, it's big, rather forbidding walls there, or from a car park around it, there's big walls just blocking the place off from the rest of the city. And perhaps this isolated camp is an attempt to sanitize this episode, this dark heritage, this dubious history for the local people, or at least to contain these terrible events within these high, thick walls. And I think the plan works. If I talk to people from Trieste, they don't go to this site. School children aren't taken there. Visitors don't go there. Nobody goes to this place. It's not really promoted. It's a national monument, but it doesn't have the footfall of visitors that you might anticipate. It's work to enclose and to lock in this horrible memory in this defined, explicit, bounded territory. The one day a year when the camp is noticed by local people is the 25th of April, which is Liberation Day in Italy, and a national holiday, and a way of remembering the Second World War, and particularly the partisan resistance to the Nazis in the north of Italy as well. But this, because of the camp, because of the histories which it enshrines and embodies, has become a quite controversial event in the last few years. In particular, the various different ethnicities of the region, of Slovenes, of Croats, of Italian nationalists and Italian rights and Italian left and so on and so forth, all end up contesting this history at this particular site as well. And you see here, this is in 2007, and we've got the national Italian officials up here laying their wreaths, but also a Slovene partisan choir who started singing different songs from the formal Italian songs at this particular point. So there's actually, in terms of their songs and their music, there was contestation, dissonant voices at this site in 2007. And this caused an international diplomatic furore and missives and arguments between the Slovenian state and the Italian state, who were neighbours in that part of northeastern Adriatic region. But this was a diplomatic episode sparked by the one time a year when people take note of this rather horrible history which is embodied by this site. So this has got dissonant histories as well, dissonant voices, and a rather uncomfortable histories locked into this site, but ones which, through the design of this site, seem to deny its wider territories and its connections. So again, territory isn't taken account of. I argue this doesn't really engage or work all that well. So I'm going to finally talk about ways of thinking beyond bounded sites of patrimonio. I've talked about two sites that I've worked on in Italy, both spectacular, big national monuments in their own way. But I'm going to talk about smaller scale sites as well, and how they perhaps try to reflect, or at least put on our agendas, how we need to think about patrimonio y territorio as being connected, as being umbilically entwined together. And these are examples from the north of England, where I live and work. When I'm not going to Italy, it's easier because I can do it all in English rather than Italian. So this is my way of suggesting that we might understand heritage better when we think about the wider territories and the spaces across which human activity develops, and the flows of migrants and trade and ideas, and across which the heritage of human activities can be traced. This is, for those of you who don't know the north of England, this is Yorkshire, the county of Yorkshire, where I live. And then this is Kingston upon Hull, where I work, and I live in the little town of Beverley there. And this is the sea going out into the North Sea there. So we're talking about this region at the moment. And the first example is the one of, it was called Sea Trek 2001, and the idea of transmigrants coming through the city of Hull and onto the Americas, onto the New World in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this is a global scale transmigration of people moving from Europe into North America, into South America. And in August 2001, 6 tall ships, as you see on the left-hand side, big square-rigged sailing ships, sailed into the port of Hull in the north of England. This was a heritage spectacle, and the local council celebrated it as such. There was an event on TV and the radio, and huge numbers of people came to celebrate and take part in this heritage spectacle. 40,000 people have turned out one evening to see the ships docking in the docks in the port of Hull. The next day, 20,000 people queued to tour around the ships themselves, and another 80,000 people looked on from the dockside. This was a huge event in the city. This was a big, big event. Well, in the north of England, this was a very significant event. But for those people on board, it was very different. Sea Trek had been funded by an American millionaire who was also a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, of the Mormon Church. And what he was doing was set up this Sea Trek Foundation to commemorate the early 19th and mid-19th century journeys of Mormon peoples from Northern Europe and from Scandinavia across the North Sea to Hull, and then across the Atlantic to New York, and then across the American continent through St. Louis, bridging the Mississippi, and then into Utah, where they now say is their Zion, is their homeland, the Mormon homeland. And this transmigration, this movement of people, was going to be celebrated by these tall ships reenacting that journey and full of Mormons who'd paid to be on board. So for the people on board, the Mormons on board, this was a very spiritual, religious experience. This was a spiritual journey. And their blogs and their online diaries at the time, this was when blogs weren't as popular as they are today, but there were still some blogs. And they talked about how pleased they were that the people of Hull were joining them in their religious reenactment of their pilgrimage from Northern Europe to Zion. The people of Hull, on the quayside, and I was one of them, had no idea about this. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew this was a religious celebration. All they thought was this was celebrating Hull's role as a historic port. So these are dissonant views. But also, the Sea Trek pilgrimage left a material sign of heritage, patrimonio, on the dockside in Hull, which is a statue you can see on the right-hand side here, cast in bronze, and it's going to last for hundreds of years. And this is less open to alternative voices. This is an emigrant family. It's not portrayed as being a Mormon family, but an emigrant family. And identical statues are found around the route from Scandinavia and Northern Europe across to Hull, and there's one in Liverpool in the north of England, there's one in New York City down by Battery Park, there's one in St. Louis, and one finally in Utah. So they trace this human passage all the way across the Northern Hemisphere. But also, this monument enshrines a particularly romanticized and heroic vision of an emigrant family. We have a nuclear family of a father and a mother and a young girl and a young boy. And they're playing various gender roles here as well. The father, as you see, is a rather square-jawed, heroic figure, standing up, gazing out to sea in their future in a foreign land. His wife, the mother, is sitting on the chest with their belongings, and she's dealing with the little girl. She's deferential, she's looking after the family. The little boy, you can just about see behind here, he's fighting off a very aggressive and unfeasibly large crab with a stick, which is just at the back here. So there's a little bit of humour written into that. But the whole story is about the brave nobility of these people travelling across the oceans to a new land and a new home. And in some respects, this is useful. Nobody really knew about the lost history of Hull as a major port, the third most important port in the British Isles, and its role in transmigration in the 19th and 20th century. 2.2 million people passed through the port between 1836 and 1914, which is 8% of all European migrants to North America in that particular period. So it's a very substantial port for transmigrants. So putting that on the historical record is useful, and marking it in space is useful. But this vision of this heroic family doesn't say anything about the persecution or the poverty or the racial issues which drove lots of people to move, such as the Mormons, from Europe to North America, where they thought they might find freedom of religious belief. Nor did it talk about the physically strong and undiseased bodies which were required to gain entry into the new colonies or the new lands of the United States and other parts of the Americas. Nor does it talk about the reciprocal flow of cultures and trade and people and bodies back and forth across the Atlantic. It's all about this one-way movement of strong, fit people to make a new world. So it does tell one vision of this story, but it does so in bronze, and it's there now forever. So here's a story of something which does talk about the spatiality of migration, but doesn't necessarily talk about it quite as well as we hoped it might. A second example is this man, and I've chosen him because he's got a little connection with Chile, so I hope you bear with me here. This is Captain James Cook, a British naval explorer and navigator who sailed through 3 Pacific journeys between 1768 and 1779. And for many people, he discovered Australia, or he's the first European to discover Australia. Lots of people lived there already, of course. He's the first European to sight Antarctica, and he sailed up the west coast of South America, taking on board supplies routinely at Valparaiso, just down the road from here, which is why I chose this example. This statue is in the town of Whitby, just up the road from Hull. It's up there. This is where Captain Cook was born. And so we see this rather, again, this heroic statue cast in bronze of this man gazing out to his future, sailing the Pacific Ocean. And his accounts, his maps are still the basis, his surveys are still the basis of all European maps of the Pacific Ocean today. And also his accounts of this is Tahiti on his 3rd voyage, painted by his onboard artist. In European imaginations, created this sense of what the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands were like as well. So we had very significant impacts upon what we call our geographical imaginations, our geographical imaginaries, how we think about things in other parts of the world from Europe. He was also, we should note, an agent of British expansionism in this period as well, funded by the Navy and by the British government. But for Whitby, in Yorkshire, he is an heroic figure, celebrated by a museum and by a statue. And the statue is inscribed by the various peoples he discovered, by the Canadians, by the New Zealanders, and by the Australians. We might note by the white colonists that he discovered, who like the idea of this white founding father of their nations. This is the cottage where he was born, near Whitby. But again, here's an example of heritage and a heritage site moving out of context, in some respects tracing the movements of Captain Cook, but also being a little bit of a strange initiative, because this is not in Whitby. This is in Melbourne, in Australia. In 1934, it was moved brick by brick from Whitby to Melbourne and set up in a park in the heart of Melbourne in South Australia. A very extravagant gesture by the Australians, but they were talking about him as being the father of their nation, the white father of their nation. For them it was important, and again this is a story about why we cannot understand monuments and heritage sites unless we think about the geographical stories behind them. My very final example relates to this city where I work, the city of Hull. And this is work which I've done with one of my PhD students, a woman called Tegwin Roberts. There's lots of heritage debates which take place in Hull. Lots of very interesting, it's a very old historic city, it's 700-800 years old. And there's an awful lot, there's a major port, the major east coast port of the United Kingdom. It's got a great deal of history there. But in this example, I'm going to show how the heritage of Hull is again embedded in territory and geography. But it also poses a question about where do we draw the line around heritage sites. I'm talking about we need to spread them out and think about these wider connections, think about the broader stories of history and geography and territory. But this project with my PhD students suggested that somewhere, of course, we have to draw the line, or else we end up telling smaller and smaller stories which are of interest to fewer and fewer people. This is talking about the bombing of Hull in the Second World War. And Hull was proportionately the most bombed city in the United Kingdom in the Second World War. And this is because it was a major port and a major industrial centre, so lots of German bombs were dropped upon the city anyway. But also because the way of flying over to bomb other parts of the northern England, of Liverpool or Manchester or Sheffield or Leeds, other major industrial cities, any bombs that were left over, the planes would be flying back over Hull and would drop any leftover bombs upon Hull. So Hull suffered disproportionately from bombing. And there's a lot of disquiet and upset in the city about these episodes, still 60, 70 years on from that particular period. But there's 2 points which I want to make about that, one of which, in all the local debates, and I've worked in Hull for 14 or 15 years now, there's a very little sense of a wider connection to the war. The local people see themselves as being victims of bombing, but not part of the war more generally. Here's an example, actually, just as part of the map, just a little part of the city around here, around one of the major railway junctions, and then this is one of the bomb maps. You can see there again the railway junction, and these are all the bombs trying to take out the railways. You can see around there and various other parts of the city, and this is the kind of damage which was done to Hull. But there's no mention in the local heritage debates about British bombing of Germany, although all of the British and American planes that were bombing Germany in return were all based upon the east coast of England, and many of them were based in airfields around Hull. So we see here, for example, this is the last bomb site on the left-hand side. It's an old cinema which was bombed on the evening of 1941. And it's the last remaining bomb site in the UK that has not been tidied up since the Second World War. 6 miles away is the site of an old airfield where the British bombers were flying and bombing Germany, bombing Dresden and bombing Berlin. And people don't make the connection. This is a monument which has recently appeared to some of the dead bomber crew. And it was a very dangerous business. Many thousands of people lost their lives on these bombing raids. They're remembered, and the bombing's remembered, but nobody makes the connection in the city. And then also, my student also uncovered this very rich and detailed and finely textured oral histories of the memory of bombing, of the memory of living in a city with the bombs coming down and trying to hide in air raid shelters and trying to get out of the way of the bombing, and then coming out to look at the destruction to see if anybody had been injured. And she got these very rich stories from old people in their 80s and their 90s, remembering the events of the 1940s. And indeed, one old lady said, "Look at the front of my house, and you can see the shrapnel from a German bomb which marked my house." And you can see just in here, this is pieces of shrapnel in the metal there, and lots of metal up down there. And you can see generally the kind of arc of this shrapnel marking the front of this house. So this is a very rich story, but it's a very small story. It's a very small story of one bomb, one house, and one old lady. And this is not an elite heritage narrative of national patrimony or memory, but an ordinary story of a mundane place and an ordinary time of war. But it does pose a question of how far do we go in tracing out these links through territory, through geography. It's very interesting, but it shouldn't be a memorial, or it's not more interesting enough, I think, to be a heritage site. In current theory in English-speaking geography, and I've been one of the people developing these theories, we like to explore the spatialities of heritage meanings as being this undulating topography, not talking about a particular site like the Vittoriano monument or the Risiera di San Saba, but talking about cities and regions as being shaped by human processes, not particular sites of heritage, but heritage everywhere. And in some places, like the Vittoriano or like the Risiera, then this heritage is more marked. It accrues and it sediments. There's more history there. In some places, not very much history, such as this old lady's house. But that's all very well and good as a theory, as an academic theory. But for people charged with defining heritage sites, you perhaps need something a little bit more fixed, a bit more substantial to work with as well. You don't have the time and the resources to look at all these memories and all these different heritages everywhere. So should we worry about telling all of these stories? I don't think we can. And we do need to be sensitive to these multiple voices, to the dissonant voices of different groups of people talking about their heritages. And we do need to take account of the wider geographies and the wider territories of heritage stories as well. But where do we stop? And where do we get to the end of where we can start to represent a meaningful sense of heritage? And this, of course, is a problem facing some of you in the room today. How do we represent heritage appropriately? We need to think about the territorio of Patrimonio, but we also need to decide where this territorio ends. That's all I have to say. I'm sorry if I went too fast in some sections. I get quite excited talking about this research. But I'm very happy to discuss some of these issues. I think we're going to have discussion sessions later on. Thank you very much.
Queremos agradecer la conferencia que nos brindó el señor David Atkinson y ahora les invitamos a ustedes a hacernos llegar sus preguntas para formulárselas a nuestro conferencista.
Esta pregunta, la primera pregunta dice, diferencia de la definición de David de qué es patrimonio con la que instaura la UNESCO.
I deliberately don't work with the UNESCO version of heritage. I see it as one of my jobs as an academic to think differently about how we might understand heritage. And so rather than fitting into the category that UNESCO have established, and as I said at the end of the talk, I understand for all very good reasons that you have to be able to manage a site, a heritage site, appropriately. But I've been trying to explore the wider connections of heritage sites and the wider ways in which we might usefully think about heritage, perhaps beyond the categories which we have already and beyond the established ways of understanding this category of heritage. So I've deliberately not engaged with what UNESCO or other heritage organisations use, and I've been trying to talk about heritage as it happens in all kinds of different places. Big, important monuments like the Vittorio or the Riviera di San Saba, or in ordinary little places like Hull or north of England, and thinking about how heritage works in all kinds of ways. And so I put that on the table as an academic contribution, and then hopefully it might inform UNESCO, it might not inform UNESCO, probably won't inform UNESCO, but nevertheless I see that as being my job to think outside of those categories and to, in my particular role, to put geography and territorio into the debates and to make people think about those issues, because that's what I can see through my training as a professor of geography. And so that's what I want to contribute to the story.
En Chile tuvimos campos de concentración y sitios de tortura en la dictadura de Pinochet. ¿Considera usted que deben ser relacionados con el patrimonio oscuro y conservarse?
And that's a very interesting question. I'm going to look at the human rights tour of Santiago on Sunday and get a sense of this history of Pinochet and his dictatorship in Chile. I don't know enough to say whether you should or should not conserve. There's a football stadium, wasn't it, where lots of the victims were held, and various buildings around the city. In a very abstract sense, I think that yes, you should, because denying this history, denying that heritage, won't help you in the longer term. Lots of people have talked to me about Pinochet and about the regime since I've only been in Chile 2 days. And people have talked to me about the regime and about democracy and about the changes in the 1990s. And so acknowledging the whole story of that past and through the sites where these things happened is, I think, important, particularly because there's lots of people still alive who were victims of Pinochet and might feel that a particular place is important for them to have a sense of their loss, of their persecution. And so they might need somewhere to go and commemorate the events under the dictatorship or their persecution. And also for future generations, it's useful to have a sense of these places. But again, we come back to the point which I finished on about, well, where do you draw the line? Where do you stop? Does every single point of persecution, is that something we need to talk about, we need to commemorate? Or is it just some points of commemoration, the major points like the football stadium? Or is it a mixture? Is it somewhere between the two? So hopefully, again, I talk as an academic, that we need to debate these things. We need to have events like this one, debating the issues of heritage and patrimonio and territorio and other ideas of how do people engage with memory, with heritage. Because that will help us to move towards a better, more inclusive and more appropriate way of dealing with this history, rather than just leaving it to a politician or a professor or a heritage specialist. Have a debate and let lots of voices come into this, and then we'll get a better solution which serves and suits lots of people better, I think.
En relación a las historias locales, ¿qué determina que se puedan valorar como patrimonio o qué diferencia existe entre la historia y el patrimonio basado en las historias locales? ¿Ha cartografiado el patrimonio cultural? ¿Podría dar una referencia metodológica?
I've had some experience of working with the City Council in Hull, where I work now in developing heritage trails. And we had a very famous poet who worked at the university, a man called Philip Larkin, who's said to be the greatest English poet of the 20th century. And he was a librarian at the University of Hull. And so we've set up a heritage trail about him and his work and the places that he talked about. So in that respect, this is part of the issue, is that they came to me as a professor and said, you know something about heritage, please help us. And I looked at what they had, and I thought it was wrong. Some of the buildings they'd included were wrong. So I ended up, as an expert, correcting and redeveloping this heritage trail about this poet for the City Council. I would rather that we had a bigger, fuller debate, rather than a few expert voices just talking about these things, as I've just articulated. I think that is a better methodology, a better way of developing an inclusive sense of community heritage, rather than just going to experts. But when I was engaged with doing heritage issues for Hull, I've done other things for the city as well, it was always a few expert voices. I don't like that. And I think what we need is more debates, more events like this one, and more senses of community heritage groups in cities like Santiago or Hull in England or Paris, Rome, Trieste, wherever it might be. And one of the things that is very encouraging from my perspective is that in England at least, these community groups and heritage groups are developing. And in part this is due to social media and the internet. In part, this is due to a phenomenon in England about people being interested in their local histories, and particularly their family histories, and tracing where their families have been and the family lineage and what roles people have played in their grandfather or great-grandfather, what kind of roles they played in economies or local politics or business. There's a lot of interest now in history. It's a phenomenon in the UK. Everybody's interested in history, national history, local history, regional history. And so I think we are moving in the right direction in England, whereby we will have a better methodology which allows groups of people to talk about the heritage which is important to them. And it won't be just experts like me talking about heritage, it'll be everybody talking about heritage. And I think that is a better methodology to move towards. We're not there at the moment, but we are going in the right direction.
En Hull no se ha aprobado incluir la educación patrimonial en niños y jóvenes para generar un cambio en esta distancia entre la historia y cómo se vive.
No, in Hull that is happening. I do some work with the local museum service. They've got some very good museums in Hull. And I have a PhD student who I'm working with at the moment. I'm one supervisor, and the other supervisor is a professor of history, and the other supervisor is the curator of history for the city museums. And this student is working to develop strategies for going out into schools. And this is about the fishing history of Hull. Hull was
had the world's largest fishing fleet in the early 20th century. So all the fish in the north and the Midlands of England, more or less, was landed in hulls, huge fleets sailing out around the North Atlantic and the Arctic waters. And then this industry collapsed very quickly in the 1970s and 1980s. And so we're working on the history of this and how this is remembered. And the PhD student is doing some excellent work about pushing this into schools so that schools are aware of what grandfather or great-grandfather or uncle did, working on the fishing boats, working on the trawlers. So yes, we are trying to do that, and we're working with the museums and the schools to make that happen. My partner is a primary school teacher, and she likewise is aware of these issues coming down from the City Council to make children aware of their patrimonial and to make them engage more with their city. And this is something which didn't happen when I was a school child in the 1970s. We didn't have this local history. It was all kings and queens. And nowadays it is happening in the UK.
Considerando lo que se conoce como el denominado patrimonio cultural chileno, o lo que ha visto en su estadía, ¿considera que su construcción es aún elitista? Es decir, una construcción elitista del patrimonio nacional, como lo era en Inglaterra hace 20 o 30 años atrás.
It's a very good question. I don't think I can answer that because I haven't really. This is my first time in Chile, so I don't know the country very well, and I don't know the city very well. So I can't really say with any truth or honesty if how your heritage sector is developing and working up. I've been impressed by some of the images which we see on the screen behind me, and the sense of all kinds of different heritage. So I think that there is a sense of the broader histories here. It's not just about the great and the powerful, it's also about industrial sites, such as you see on the screen in front of you at the moment, and Chile's development in relation to the world economy. So that's all promising, but I can't really say if it's in Santiago if the heritage has been really adapted or has developed very well at the moment. I might have a better sense of that on Sunday after I've been on the human rights tour and I've walked around for a couple more days. I'll let you know in the future.
¿Cuál ha sido la experiencia del cruce de los instrumentos de planificación con la denominación o definición de sitios patrimoniales? ¿Cuál es el nivel de apropiación del patrimonio por parte de la ciudadanía? Sorry, two questions. Which has been the experience of the different instruments of planification with the definition of heritage sites, like the link between heritage sites and the instruments of planification, urban planification in England?
Was it a good example, my experience?
Yes.
I mean, my experience is, this is something that's become clear to me in the last couple of days, is that my sense of patrimonio is rooted in Italian examples, which I've worked on, and English examples, which I've worked on. But then people have been saying to me, well, what is it like in Germany, or in France, or in Spain? And I don't know. I go to these countries and I consume their heritage sites, but I don't know really how the planificazione, how the planning system engages with heritage. So I don't want to say absolutely that it's an appropriate process in the UK or it's different in not so good in France or not so good in Germany, because this comparative sense of the wider processes around the world, I haven't really got much of a grasp upon that. I don't really understand it very well. What is becoming clear everywhere that I go in Europe and other parts of the world is people are talking about heritage, and people are trying to celebrate heritage and to promote their places where they live, their city, their town, through heritage. And so at one level, this is a global phenomenon, but also, do we need a global answer to what heritage is and how heritage works with planning organisations? I don't think we do. And again, speaking as a geographer, I think we need local or national regulations for different national contexts and situations. So to deal with heritage in Italy is different from dealing with heritage in England, which is different from dealing with heritage in South Africa, or different from dealing with heritage in India or Burma. And so perhaps we need to be aware that these things should be negotiated, as I said earlier, with local peoples and with local government and local structures, which will find the right heritage for different places around the world. But the pressure is that this international sense of heritage is good, heritage is our way forward, it marks places out as being distinct in a globalizing world, and it is a way of encouraging development and encouraging regeneration of places who've lost industrial functions. And so this is going to be one of the key issues over the next 20, 30 years, I think, about how much heritage can we have, and as I talked about, where do we draw the line and stop doing heritage? We don't just want a few individual points, and we don't just want to hear about kings and queens, but we don't want to hear about everything either. So somewhere we've got to find the balance. I don't know what it is, but I do think it has to be negotiated locally in every context by all the voices of any local community. That's not a good answer to the question, but that's as best as I can do, I think, at the moment, because I think otherwise we end up with experts just pronouncing upon heritage, and I don't think that's always a good way forward.
¿Considera que el patrimonio puede utilizarse como una herramienta de enseñanza y ser transmitido como parte de la formación docente? ¿Y ser los profesores los conductores geográficos que ayuden a conservar el patrimonio?
I think that's a very good question. Yes, as I said in response to a different question, yes, I think that we should have a sense of local histories in schools and how local histories are linked into wider histories around the world and wider processes. I think that's very important. It would make people growing up in small towns. I grew up in a small town in the north of England, and I didn't have a sense that history was anywhere near me. It wasn't important. It wasn't significant for me and my town. As I got older, I recognised it was actually an important town in terms of international weaving and cotton production and flows of cotton manufactured goods around the British Empire and from North America in the 19th century. I didn't have any sense of that when I was growing up in Lancashire, near Manchester, in the 1970s. So I think we should have teaching in schools, and I think it should be useful. I also speak as someone who's married to a teacher, and I know that teachers in England don't want any more training because they're so busy with marking and preparation of courses. I think it's a very good idea that they would have some kind of guide or some kind of training to help them teach this material. What happens in England is they're given things that are called training packs, which is a sheaf of papers, lots of papers and some images and some websites, which will allow them to learn about the heritage. The teachers learn about the heritage, and then it suggests ways that they can teach this to students. So for teachers, these heritage packs or these teaching packs, it could be for any subject, not heritage. It could be about genetics or about religion or about languages or geography. But these teaching packs are very useful. I believe that I haven't seen any, but I think that they have these for people teaching history now, which embeds history and heritage into wider processes and patterns. So that is happening in the UK. Perhaps it needs to happen a little bit more. I don't know. We've got a Minister of Education in the UK who's changing everything at the moment, and he wants people to learn Latin again, which we haven't done since the 1950s. And this is a very conservative and reactionary position on these ideas. So at the moment, everything's
all the teaching establishment is trying to stop him and his very old-fashioned ideas from changing the school patterns. But in normal times, this kind of thing is happening. Okay.
Thank you very much, David.